Hi everyone, welcome to Mamsu Code video guide session. In the previous video, we wrote our failing test for the null check, and in this video, we're going to make it pass. So let's get into the service, which is expecting the validation to happen. Here I'm going to write a couple of lines, so I'm going to scope it out into parentheses. Okay. So here, since I'm scoping it out, it's going to expect an explicit return keyword. I'm given that here. So what am I going to do? First thing that I'm going to do is to validate if this input is null or not. So I'm going to say is if sample equal to null. If it is null, I'm going to throw a exception. So throw new null sample exception. Okay. So I'm going to resolve it. Fine. Hope you remember what we are going to do is, categorize the exception. So all type of validation exceptions have to be wrapped under one category, right? So here I can say throw new sample validation exception of new null sample exception. Okay. Then what am I going to do? So let's test if this is going to be happy. Right click, run test. So it still says failed. So what it says is expected invocation of the mock once, but it was 0 time. Yeah, so we were expecting it to log, right? So let's get here and let's say whenever this happens, this dot logging broker dot log error of the exception itself. So we want to log the actual exception. So in that case, what we can do is var exception equal this, and then we can say log error of exception and then throw the exception. Okay, since throw and return are like this, we can separate it out. Let's check. Right click and run the test. Okay, this is passed because we have met the expectation for the code. Let's take a look. So this particular code is doing three things. One, it's going to validate something. If the validation fails, it's going to throw the exception, and then it's returning in case it's not, null, right? So for the better coding practice, we can leverage partial classes and then make the code look even more simpler. Okay, so let's just have this whole code commented out to compare what we're going to talk about, right? So we have this one here. I'm going to remove the code that we have written so far. So this is the actual functionality. Whenever you're calling the add sample, it's going to, save it. So this test is now going to fail because it's not handling the validations. Yeah, it's failed. So let's get back here. So what we are going to say is whenever you're calling me this method, I'm going to validate sample, and then I'm going to pass in that data to perform validation. Okay, so this whole thing that we have done here is now going to this particular method. Where can we define this method? Let's again go here and define this. So I'm going to say private static, and this is not going to return me anything. So void validate sample, and then I'm going to say sample and sample. Okay, so now it comes with my validation. So throw new null sample exception. Right, so now what we have said is this particular method, when it's called, it's going to validate. If this method is not going to throw, so the control will continue, right? If it's not going to throw it, the control will go and execute the next line. If this line is getting executed, this line will not be executed. That's how the control flow works. Okay. Right now, this service is offering you the method for adding the data, right? What if it's going to provide you a method for updating, for deleting, for remove? So we might have an opportunity for refactoring it or optimizing the code so that the validate sample method is being reused for other workflows, right? So we're going to leverage validation uh, into partial classes. So let's go define the partial class sample service dot validations dot cs, right? Since this is partial, this one is also here, partial. Okay. Okay, so what we're going to do is move this method. So any code that is going to perform our validation is going to be, you know, mentioned here. So this needs references. And okay, so now this code has even become, it's even more simpler now, right? It's very clear that when this method is getting called, I'm going to validate. If that's fine, I'm going to save it and return that value. Nice. So we have solved the first puzzle, right? That validations have been moved to the validations partial class. Now we need to handle this exception. So when this type of exception is getting thrown, we need to handle this, wrap it up into the categorization of validation exception, and then log it. How are we going to do it? We are going to leverage another partial class here. So we say sample service dot exceptions dot cs. Okay, and I'm going to say partial. So here what I'm going to do is you're going to learn something new, right? There is this concept called delegations, which means that you're going to say this whole method is being delegated to this particular call of responsibility. So the syntax for that is I'm going to name that delegate method, which is going to execute this line of code by taking care of the validation. So this particular method is being delegated to this method to execute these lines of code. Okay, how is that going to be linked? What's that delegate going to look like? So private delegate is a type. And then what I'm going to do here is what is this delegate going to return? It's going to return sample, right? So it's not void. It's going to return sample. Solve this. And then the delegate method name is returning sample function. So this is the method here. Now I'm going to say that this delegate is going to be the parameter for this try catch. So this try catch is taking this parameter, right? So it's like try catch is a method. It's like open and close. Under that method, you're passing this. So this whole thing will be hold here. So here I'm going to say private. And what is this going to return? Sample try catch of the parameter itself is the whole set of code, right? So this one and here. Let me remove the extra lines. Okay, so you're expecting it to return. It's not returning. That's fine. So what I'm going to say is try is a shortcut. So try double tap will give you this whole syntax of execution, right? So here, what is this going to execute? I'm going to say, hey, you're going to pass me some lines of code in this particular variable. I'm just going to return that. So returning, and this is a function, right? So that's all. Whatever you're passing in to call this, I'm just going to execute it and return. But this whole execution is under this scope, so try catch scope, so that if an error occurs, that is in this case, it's going to be null sample exception, null sample exception. So when this error is going to occur, I'm going to handle it. Okay. So I'm going to say throw the same thing, right? New sample validation exception of null sample exception. Okay. Hope you remember we're missing something. What is that? We need to log. Again, since there's going to be a scope of optimization, I can move this into another piece of code, because what if more than one validation exception is going to be executed, right? So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to say this whole thing is going to a method. So create and log the validation exception. And this is going to take in this parameter. I'm going to write the method. So private, and this one is going to return what? The wrapper. That's my, contract that is going to be handshaked, returned back to the caller. So this, and the method name is create and log validation exception. Again, what is the input parameter? I'm going to generalize it because this can happen for any type of validation exception, right? So let's say except. Okay. So now what I want to do is get this exception, wrap it up, log it, and then give it back. So here I say sample validation exception equal new sample validation exception of exception. Okay, now I've wrapped up. I'm good here. The next thing that I have to do is log this particular thing. Next, throw. So since this is an error, I'm just throwing it. Okay, let's go back here. See this line of code has been transformed to this in an elegant and a simple way. What it's going to do, hey, all the validation, I'm going to move that to validations file. All the exception handling, right? So the exception handling for all the workflow or the code executions, method calls that's within this, I'm moving it here. And that's beauty. So clean and simple now. Let's try and see if this is being successful or if I missed anything else. So right click and run, it's passed. Cool. So let me remove this since it's not getting used. Okay, as a recap, what did we do? Whenever there's an add sample being called, I'm going to delegate the whole code that's defined inside this into a delegate method. What is this delegate method going to do? It's going to get that set of code and it's going to execute it. If at all there is an error occurring in this particular execution, I'm going to catch the errors and then I'm going to log it. I'm going to wrap it and I'm going to throw back. So the validation, that's the first line here, gets executed here. I think let's do this. So let's hit a breakpoint and go through the flow here so that the step by step, what's first, what's next, it's there. So let me do F10, F10, F10. So now I want to get inside the execution. So F11, F11. So if you see, action is deferring the execution. So this one is not executing right away. Only when you're materializing, you're trying to read, know what the data is, that's when it's actually executing, right? That's the beauty of action. So F11, it's come here. So this is the whole set of code that's going to get executed. F11. It's come inside try catch because that's the method call, right? And let me see. If you see this, it's the method, and you can open up and read through what all it has. So I'm trying to execute it. Okay, now I'm executing the first line. Now where does it go? It also opened up the validations file and here. Now here I am and it's null because that's what we were testing for. Now the null sample is getting thrown. What happened here? When this line of code was throwing an error, this catch caught it and it says, hey, there's an exception, right? So F10, cool, because that's the exact exception that has occurred and it has captured. Again, F11 getting inside the execution. What it has done is your sample is null. I'm wrapping that sample into my wrapper. I'm logging that and I'm throwing it back. So let me do F10 again because that's an exception it's throwing. F10, where does it come? So now it's come to the same exception as, that's the next line of it is same exception as, right? So here, this is my expected. It's going to perform my validation. It looks good. I'm going to verify if the actual call for saving the data is never called. So that also looks good. Then what will I be validating? No other dependencies on any other workflow or any other method to be called. Okay, looks good, looks good. Now we have a passing test. Nice. Sometimes if you're not understanding the flow, I kind of prefer having the breakpoint running through that will clearly give you the picture of execution, right? So F10 is for just going to the next one. F11 is for getting inside of that particular line itself. Okay, cool. So I'm sorry. Analyze code cleanup, run code cleanup, and run everything. Good. And then I'm going to say this is a pass. Nice. So we have completed our first validation test case. Now we have another test case that we will be focusing on in the next video. Thank you for watching.